Okay, welcome everybody to Freetrail Friday. Hope everybody's having a great end of your week. Welcome to our fun little Friday weekly live stream. I'm joined today by Dave Dombrow and Bryan Bhark. We're going to talk about the process of making trail footwear. These guys are very experienced on the product side of the running industry, and I'm really excited to hear all about the process of creating the most important piece of equipment that we all take out onto the trails every day, from the concept and ideation of the product to the actual launch. It's going to be really fun. We're going to talk about the creative process, the challenges, the joy of seeing the footwear out on the trails on people's feet, and see that idea come into reality in physical form. If you've got questions for our guests today, please make sure to drop them in the chat. Let us know where you're writing in from. We're going to pull the best questions out of there, and I'm going to try to introduce them into the conversation today. We're going to have Dave and Bryan introduce themselves in just a second. Before we get to it, a big thank you to Oura Ring, our sponsor of all of our Freetrail Friday live streams. I am rocking an 84 readiness score today, guys, so I should be in top form for our conversation. 85 heart rate variability last night, so good vibes for our Friday morning compliments of Oura Ring. For those who are watching or listening, please do take advantage of our special offer. You can find a link in the description here in YouTube or in the show notes of the podcast, where you can get 6 months free subscription with a purchase of the new Gen 3 ring. These things are super cool. I've been using them for 4 or 5 years from the first generation, and we are super appreciative to have Oura's support of Freetrail Friday. Also, speaking of products, check out my fire new Trail Culture crew neck. We just put these on the website yesterday. Almost sold out already. We've only got 3 size smalls left. So if you guys are in the market for some swag, please do visit freetrail.com and check out our e-commerce store and grab a hoodie or a crew neck or a t-shirt. We certainly do appreciate it, and it helps keep the lights on here in my home podcast studio. But a big warm welcome to both Bryan and Dave. Guys, I want to start with brief introductions to both of you. Dave has been on the podcast before, so Bryan, we're going to start with you. Tell the people a little bit about yourself and what your role is now over at Brooks.
Morning, everyone. Dylan, thanks for having me on the show. It's an absolute pleasure and honor. Excited to do this. My name is Bryan Bhark. I'm a innovation footwear developer at Brooks Running. Been with Brooks for about 6.5 years. Time definitely flies. So excited that have the opportunity to kind of chat a little bit more about what makes footwear fun. But live in Issaquah, Washington, about 15-20 miles east of Seattle, and have a lot of local trails here to romp around on. Been in the industry a total of 9-ish years, all in product development in performance running. So prior to Brooks, I was at New Balance for a few years, where I cut my teeth, and then moved out to the Pacific Northwest.
And here you are. And we were just talking before we went live about how you bumped into our producer, Ryan Thrower, on the trails of Tiger Mountain. So Bryan definitely does live the sport. And Dave, before we get to you, Bryan, I just want to maybe follow up real quick, because people rave about you in the sport. I don't know if you know that, but your reputation always precedes you. I mean, Hillary Allen did so just a couple of months ago on my podcast. You're also a great athlete yourself, but maybe just give a quick maybe introduction to some of the products that you've worked on over at Brooks that people are familiar with.
Sure. Specifically, while I've been on the innovation team, I've been part of the Blue Line process, and within the Blue Line team and process, I've been able to have the pleasure to work on the Brooks Catamount, the Cascadia 16, the Hyperion Tempo, Hyperion Elite. So a good mix of road and trail product, but all kind of cutting edge, new technologies, those sort of things.
Okay, Dave, broadcasting from across town here in Portland, Oregon. Maybe you've been on the podcast, like we said before, but give a brief introduction to yourself and your stalwart career in the industry.
Sure. Dave Dombrow, Portland, Oregon. Let's see, co-founder of Speedland. What can I tell you? Been in the industry over 20 years. Nike, Puma, Under Armour. Done pretty much every type of product, but Speedland focuses on trail running. So that's what we're doing today. And yeah, what else can I tell you, Dylan?
Well, Dave, you're being very very modest. I mean, weren't you like the chief design officer at Under Armour? I mean, that's a very high level position, probably reporting directly to Kevin Plank. So
yeah,
maybe brag about yourself a little bit more, could you?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I've worked. I've worked. Started as a designer, obviously, in the industry, and then you work your way up through the ranks through senior designer, and then eventually you become a creative director of sorts, and creative director at different companies. And then, yes, eventually I was the chief design officer at Under Armour. And in that case, I was covering pretty much every product they made. But I wasn't necessarily designing every product. I was looking over from a directional point of view. So it's interesting as the role changes through the years, your day-to-day changes significantly as well. But it all starts and all goes back to, for me, goes back to design and product. And that's at the core of who I am. So.
Heck yeah. So let's start with a broad understanding of what type of person is attracted into these roles, because a lot of people are really interested about how they get their start in the industry. And for me personally, I can say that my brain totally does not work like yours does. I'm somebody who's sort of a reading and writing and talking type person, if you can't tell, rather than sort of like a drawing and creative and designy type person. And so I want you guys to maybe provide some commentary on the nature versus nurture aspect of having that creative design oriented mind. Is it something that you were sort of born with and interested in from a young age? And then how did you sort of develop those skills over the course of your career? Maybe we'll start with you, Bryan.
Sure. So I think first and foremost, it kind of comes down to having a natural curiosity for how things are built or how things kind of come together. I have a background in human factors engineering, which is a pretty fascinating field of study. And I think this just kind of helped to facilitate my drive for better understanding product and humans' interaction with product. I've been a lifelong runner, and I remember, as kind of funny as it sounds, in high school cross country, I had wondered at one point, like, running shoes are pretty interesting. I wonder how they get built. But I kind of left the thought there and then went on to college and did some stuff after college, and then eventually found my way into this industry, not by accident, by a lot of very focused networking and, kind of searching far and wide for opportunities that might allow me to kind of cut my teeth in the industry. So that's
but it was born from like an early understanding that you were curious about how things work. Dave, do you sort of identify with that as well? Were you the type of kid who always was looking at cars and products and things and wondering how they were made and how you could maybe create something like that yourself?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I grew up in Southern California in San Diego, and I was growing up in the kind of the BMX skate world, I guess you would say. So I was the kid that was always tearing stuff apart, rebuilding it, customizing it, repainting it. So for me, where build meets art was always kind of the center of who I was growing up. And actually, I always thought, because you don't know anything about design, right? So I always thought I was going to be an architect, and eventually found out about design, and then realized, oh, then once that path set, then there was no holding me back on that path. But yeah, I was definitely tearing stuff apart, building it. I guess some people would say that's a tinkerer of sorts, but yeah, that was me growing up pretty much my whole life, and it actually still is.
Yeah, awesome. Well, again, my brain does not work like that, but I have huge respect and admiration for the creative brains that make our sport possible with the great footwear products that are now on the market compliments of people like you. Let's keep it basic for another quick question and let you guys kind of explain the org chart, the organizational structure within the companies that you've worked at. Dave, I know it's different for you now as a two-man shop here in Portland, but I know there's like a difference between designers and developers within a traditional footwear team. So what is sort of that org chart? What does that org chart look like? And maybe aside from designers and developers, who are the other personnel required to kind of bring a footwear product to market at a traditional brand? Maybe Dave, you can start.
Yeah, I mean, I think, org chart can answer this a lot of different ways. I think I'll probably go right to, and maybe where Bryan would go as well, to the triad is kind of the core of the product team, right? So you have a developer, a designer, and a marketing representative, which is usually called a PLM of sorts, right? And so that's the team that kind of brings the product to life. Now, the truth is, there's another team, which Bryan also has currently working on or worked on in the past, which is works further out, right? So it's when you see a product, it's really not just the triad, but they are kind of the core of bringing it to life, let's say, commercially. But there's an innovation side at most brands, all brands that I've worked at, and Brooks as well, where that technology gets fed into the pipeline, let's say, to the team, and so there's already usually a starting point, where it comes from. So I don't know, Bryan, you're in the innovation side more, so you can touch on that.
Yeah, Bryan,
absolutely.
Talk about innovation and then also explain the difference between like a designer and developer, understanding that the PLM is kind of the marketing voice in the room. What's the difference between a designer and a developer? And then talk about how innovation comes into the picture.
Yeah, so I think to answer your question about developer, and I'll actually let Dave answer the design piece, but as a developer, you're kind of, you're looking at the product from an engineering standpoint, construction, build, materials. You oftentimes manage the communication with our factory partners or our R&D hubs located elsewhere in the world. You're responsible for managing a lot of the physical property testing of materials. You're doing a lot of interfacing with kind of these other functions. And then you also are managing kind of the cost of the shoe. Obviously, you're working very closely with the triad, as Dave alluded to the entire time. And I feel like, at least for me, the most successful product that I've ever been able to work on is when you have an incredibly tight triad that's focused on the product. It's not about appeasing your individual functions. It's about being focused on the needs of the athlete, the runner, the product. And so that's basically what I do. And then on the innovation side, as Dave mentioned, yeah, we're usually working on technologies that are anywhere from 3 to 5+ years out from seeing the light of day in market. And, we'll kind of, it'll serve as kind of we'll have this kind of roadmap of new foam compounds, new materials, other technologies that we want to kind of incubate, test, revise, and then eventually do what we call a technology transfer to an inline team, a team that's going to actually bring this to market. And so that's kind of how that process starts, really far out. And so there's been a number of technologies I've worked on when I first started in innovation that are just starting to see the light of day. And you're just like, wow, that was a long time ago. So things do take a while to get to market, especially when you're looking further out.
Yeah, so cool. Great. That was an awesome and helpful summary of how it works. The designer probably makes the sketches, draws it out, has the vision. The developer takes that vision and tries to put the pieces together practically with the materials, interfacing with the manufacturing team. PLM is the marketing voice, and then innovation is developing technology to hopefully feed it into that pipeline further on.
And I should add all those innovation technologies don't usually make it to the market.
Yeah.
People think, oh, you're working on it's kind of one of those things you might work on 20 to get to 5.
Okay.
Over a long period of time. So it's not a 1-to-1 ratio, which I don't know if that's understood, throughout the footwear community.
Yeah. It's like any startup too. There's more failures than successes. It's all about the batting average, I guess. So maybe just a broad question about our sport, trail running, where we all sort of find our personal passions as people who have worked across different product categories. Dave, I know you were involved in everything over at Under Armour. Bryan, you mentioned that you have been involved in some of the Hyperion Road product there at Brooks and probably at New Balance as well. Any comments you can make about the ascendancy of trail and trail products within the category? Like maybe Bryan, this is a good question for you. At Brooks, is there more priority being placed behind trail product relative to road product as the sport continues to grow globally?
Absolutely. I think Brooks is very deliberate with the strategic decisions they make in terms of how they want to focus on certain runner archetypes or certain consumer groups. And trail is obviously, it's no surprise that the sport continues to outpace the growth of the rest of the running population. And there's a lot of white space from an innovation standpoint. Brands are doing amazing things, especially the things that you guys are doing at Speedland to really kind of set the bar high. And so Brooks has really prioritized trail kind of from all points of view, from a product point of view, a marketing point of view, athlete point of view, and just, getting all teams on board in terms of what is our point of view on trail. Because, we have a long history with trail. We've been working with Scott Jurek for, over a decade, and we have the history of a shoe like the Cascadia, but how do we continue to evolve and then modernize that while at the same time bringing new trail shoes into the line, such as the Caldera and the Catamount, that are addressing different parts of the trail community. And I think ultimately what we're trying to do at Brooks is provide a quiver. So every shoe should be able to provide a benefit to a runner. So in theory, a trail runner could own every Brooks trail shoe and have their own specific use case for it.
Yeah. That's great. Dave, anything to add? I think obviously we were just talking about innovation, and Bryan just mentioned that you guys are taking a different tact where innovation is kind of at the core of what you do. And obviously it's a hyper premium product that takes a very novel approach to the market. Any comments about maybe your experience at Under Armour and how trail was maybe at part of things that you worked on, or when you sensed sort of the opportunity within this subcategory of running as it relates to the rest of the running market?
Yeah, I mean, I feel, and there's not exactly like hard data that's saying this, but I feel like now, a lot of brands are putting a lot more emphasis on trail as recently, whether that's Brooks or Hoka or, the list goes on. But, to be honest, I feel that trail's been a bit neglected, if I'm honest, through the years. And that's part of the reason why Speedland went into it, because I feel like a lot of the emphasis in R&D was being put into the road. For a lot of reasons. One, it's at this time still a much bigger business, but like Bryan said, trail's growing rapidly, and so I think now brands are starting to put more emphasis there. Not that they weren't making good product before. I don't want that to come across what I was saying, but I think that now with everything that's going on with trail, it's not, a trail and a road shoe are not the same thing. You shouldn't look at it the same way, and functionally they're quite different too. So, I think a lot of times they were kind of lumped together, and that's at Speedland. That's why we're taking a very different approach.
Yeah, cool. So let's start going into the entire process of actually creating one of these products, and maybe Bryan, we'll start with you. I know like the Catamount that you've mentioned a couple of times was a new product. It wasn't like you were just iterating a Cascadia that has been around now since the early days of Scott Jurek and is probably the best-selling trail shoe of all time. Where does the process start to bring the Catamount to market? What's the first step? What is the white space that you're targeting? Is this a decree from sort of the product executives? What's the first step of creating the Catamount as an example?
Sure. Going back about 3 years now, it's when we first started to reignite the energy around our trail focus, and we had built a new trail team. A lot of incredible athletes from all parts of the community were pulled in, and I think we looked at ourselves really well in the mirror. We kind of did a thorough inventory of what our current trail line looks like, and one thing that was clearly missing was something on the lighter, faster end that could be used more for racing. And so generally speaking, we start with a big investment into consumer insights, or in this case, it was athlete insights. So we wanted to build a shoe that would perform well at a race such as Western States, something a little bit more runnable, something that was fast and protective, but still could go the distance. And so the Triad and we spent at least a few weeks speaking with all the athletes about what your dream race shoe might be, and you kind of get a lot of answers, because some people they prefer to have something that's much more cushioned, a little bit softer, and other people want something super minimal, something low to the ground where they feel everything. And so you kind of have to take all of that into context and read between the lines to figure out, like, okay, what's the product that we really need to deliver that these athletes are both overtly asking for, but also addressing some needs that maybe they're not expressing specifically in these conversations. So what are we kind of getting through some potential latent needs here? And so that's kind of how the process started. We just spoke with all the athletes. We spoke with consumers, both in North America and Europe, and really tried to understand, okay, what is this opportunity that we have to add to the Brooks Trail line? And given, it is a brand new trail shoe, there was a lot of freedom in terms of where we could go, but it kind of worked out well in the sense that it was a product I had the opportunity to work on while also being on the innovation team. And I was asked, do we have a toolbox of, what does our toolbox look like in terms of technologies? And we had been working on the supercritical foam for a little over a year, and it provided kind of the perfect opportunity to showcase this foam technology in this shoe, because we knew that the application would be perfect for trail. So that's
Cool.
kind of where we started.
Awesome. So once the consumer insights are there, how do you put pen to paper, Dave? Maybe talk about the Speedland. I mean, you saw this white space, you thought you wanted to bring innovation to it. Did you and Kevin start actually just drawing on paper? Where does design get introduced?
Yeah. Well, in the case of Speedland, I guess we did a little different. We just started building, which I can pretty much tell you does not usually happen at any brand. So we literally have a workshop and we just started building. So we had parts, and whether that was plates or whether that was, clay or BOA parts, we just had parts, and we had different things we knew we wanted to use to optimize different features, whether that was fit, traction, propulsion, cushion. And we just started building literally in the workshop. And then when we were done building in 3D, we literally just sent that directly to the factory. Yeah. So that's a pretty different way of working. But when you're taking a totally different approach, that's okay to break the rules sometimes. So normally you might start with a design sketch or something.
Cool. So you start with a design sketch probably after you get those consumer insights, and then it's all about maybe working with the developer to figure out the materials and stuff. So maybe talk about that, Dave.
Sure. Yeah. So if you have the design sketch and you're working like Bryan said earlier, hopefully you're working kind of in lockstep, hand in hand, right from the start with, if you're at a bigger company, not Speedland, a bigger company, you're working with the PLM, with the developer, and the designer all sitting at the same table. And hopefully even the PLM is, selecting materials as well, right? You almost don't want a delineation between any of those people. Like the developer should be part designer, the PLM should be part designer, the designer should be part marketer. So everything should, and I actually think even the developer should be part marketer too. I think the more crossover you can have, everybody can offer to the project, but they'll offer it in slightly different ways. And those are always the most successful, right? Like I always want to, let's all go out, let's go somewhere, let's brainstorm together. And hopefully it's a collective creation versus, one person saying, oh, I did the sketch or something. That's always better when it comes together with multiple minds.
Fascinating. And I think a great lesson for those who are listening who want to get their start in the industry. If you're into design, you maybe should also have some chops at marketing too, because it will probably make you a more valuable team member.
Well, yeah. And I mean, I don't want to, I haven't really talked about it, but at least the key to my career and many others that have been around me is storytelling, right? And understanding the why and why you do things and why something needs to be done and why would anybody even care about what you're doing? Yeah. That stuff's really important. And, otherwise, an old boss of mine named Gene McCarthy, who's actually a very accomplished runner, said, yeah, the world doesn't need another shoe brand, and unless you're doing something unique and purposeful. And I think that's true. You really need to have that why. And sometimes you see projects that are started, and if you can't say that why within one sentence, that you haven't, you're not really doing the right thing.
Yeah. Awesome. So obviously companies need to control their margins and have predictability of sales relative to past products and to competitive brands. So maybe Bryan, talk about where retail price comes into the picture through the design process. And then maybe we'll go to Dave to talk about how Speedland is taking a novel approach.
Sure. Yeah. Ultimately, as part of kind of this consumer insights and marketing insights, this is something that falls a little bit more on the shoulders of the PLM or the product line manager in terms of gauging where the price point of the shoe needs to land. And to Dave's point, I think it's very collaborative, right? And I think design has an input, development has an input, but we're trying to understand what are kind of the key competitors to the shoe that we want to build. And generally what's the appetite in the market? What's someone willing to pay for a product like this? And, we kind of work backwards from there in terms of, okay, how much money do we ultimately have to play with to build this product? And a lot of times, newer products that are introducing new innovations, new foam compounds, they generally have a little bit more flexibility because processes are slower, the technology is more novel. And so you have, you can maybe get away with a slightly lower margin and a higher, kind of landed cost, or we call it our FOB, but essentially the cost of the landed cost of a shoe. And so you get a little bit more flexibility on that end, but ultimately, you still have to roll it up to how it's going to sell in a retail environment amongst its competitive set.
And what are the factors that go into that? Obviously, it's the material costs, the manufacturing costs, and probably the volume. Is that right? That
exactly.
Goes into FOB?
Yeah. We have what we call like an amortization cost, which is, it goes into the number of molds that we have to open, both for upper materials, patterns, as well as the most expensive part, which are molds for midsoles and outsoles, and basically the average cost of those.
Is that what they call tooling?
Exactly.
Okay. Yep. So Dave, maybe explain what tooling is, and also talk about how Speedland took a very novel approach to this FOB phenomenon.
Sure. Well, I'll talk tooling first. Yeah, tooling. So, every size, and I think this is probably like pretty simple stuff and everybody probably understands this, but I'll just go over it real quick anyways. is that every size, that's opened for for a shoe, take whatever shoe, it had the bottom, the midsole and the outsole require tooling, and that's basically a mold. So, all the way from a, very small size, whether you're talking a 3.5, 4, all the way up to a 13, 14, 15, those all require molds, and that's your tooling cost. And that can add up. That's I'm living it. And that's quite expensive stuff. So, and what you do is you amortize that, unless you decide to pay the tooling up front, you amortize that over a certain amount of pairs. So obviously if you're doing, large amounts, so if you're doing 100,000 or you're doing 1 million in some cases, when you're talking about bigger brands, that amortization, it makes your tooling cost quite a bit less. But if you're doing 1,000 pairs or you're doing 5,000 pairs, your tooling amortization is going to be quite expensive, right? Because you're amortizing over less pairs. Mm-hmm. So that's tooling. I won't go too into it. Deeper than that. But I will say, so Speedland, we're kind of the opposite. We never really had an FOB, if I'm honest, and we never really had anything that you normally would have. What we did have is we wanted to take a no compromise approach and just build or aggregate what we considered the best of the best at every turn, and that would determine our FOB, and then we would determine our size run ahead of time. Just based off how big we call them commissions, how big we wanted to make the commission, basically. So it is kind of an opposite approach, but that's the way we approached it, because the reason we could do that, and Bryan touched on it, is normally you have to take distribution into account, but at this time, we're mainly a DTC brand, direct to consumer. So we control the distribution side for the most part as well. So it's a different business model for sure, and giving it a go and seeing how it goes.
Well, maybe this is a good time to actually talk about the D2C concept versus traditional distribution. Obviously, D2C is huge now. I mean, it's sort of the talk of every industry, and through all different products that are coming to market, whether it's footwear or apparel or sunglasses or hats or anything, D2C is sort of a global phenomenon. And even big brands like Nike and Adidas, and I'm sure probably Brooks, are thinking about how they can have more of a direct relationship with their consumer. Bryan, maybe you can talk about when you saw this sort of shifting and what some of the bigger brands are doing to pivot more to D2C.
Sure. There was obviously a really big push to this when COVID hit. Obviously, with stores being shut down, not being able to distribute through our normal retailers. But I think what became more important is how brands wanted to show up and really connect with consumers, with runners. And that kind of went back to a basic approach in terms of, who are these runners that we're servicing? Who are these athletes that we're servicing? And really trying to be specific in terms of, what their needs are, as well as what sort of product suits the type of activities they're doing. And this goes not just for footwear, but also apparel and accessories. And so, it's kind of a new muscle that the marketing team needs to flex in terms of how we look at data, how we aggregate data, and then what sort of marketing tools are going to be used to be more personal to that consumer. So an email that I might get about the new trail shoe that's coming out from, Brooks might be different than an email someone else might get about a new road shoe, because they're primarily a road runner versus me. I'm primarily a trail runner. So yeah. A little bit more targeted marketing in that sense.
So going back to the design process, how much iteration is there? And maybe also, since you've both worked on road product, just provide some comments on the design considerations that are specific to trail product. Dave, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think in a macro lens, right, is that with road product, you're really talking about more of a linear motion, right? And that's why what you see with the super shoes and the more rigid carbon plates, why that works so well, because you're working off multiple planes, but in a macro sense, you're working off one plane as far as going forward. And when you start talking about trail, that all falls apart, right? Because you're landing on uneven ground. You're talking about more lateral motions. I won't say it's as extreme laterally maybe as say basketball or a sport or a cleated sport maybe, but in some cases you are doing very similar motions, right, with how you're planting and whatnot, and the different ground that you're on. So it's just very, very different, and they really aren't, other than the biomechanics of running, they are designed quite differently. The traction obviously is designed differently. The hardnesses and the durometers and where you want that in relationship to where you strike and everything is different. Everything is different. The ingress and ingress and egress of keeping stuff out of the shoe is quite different, right? Like how you would build an upper for the road is significantly different than how you would build it in trail. So I mean, from all aspects, I think you're solving quite different functional problems. I don't know if you'd agree to that, Bryan, but
100%.
Bryan, maybe talk about the iteration and prototyping process, and at what point athletes maybe come into the picture for you guys at Brooks.
Sure. For us, we try and involve the athletes basically from day one. If we're gonna, if we're interested in coming to market with an all new trail shoe or an iteration to a trail shoe, we're trying to, pull their insight and feedback in. We're getting ready to work on, the Caldera 6 on its 6th iteration is getting ready to launch in a few months. We've already started, iterating on the Caldera 7, and, Hillary and a number of the other athletes have been really involved in providing their feedback on the Caldera 6 to better understand, okay, like what are the modifications and tweaks that we need to make to take the shoe to the next level. And so we'll normally go through 2 to 3 rounds of prototyping. So that's design, developing, prototyping before what we typically call a confirmation round. And that's where we get our final sample in all the colorways that we're going to go to market with. And then we have, photo shoot samples, we have salesman samples that go out to key accounts that they use to, sell the shoe in to various retailers and also showcase as part of different marketing campaigns. And so those 2 to 3 rounds of iterating generally take, a little over a year, 3 to 5 months, depending on the project for one round of prototyping. And that goes through several design reviews, development prototypes, or, rough prototypes that we call pullovers. And so you'll get these, half pair prototypes in that are, kind of built out of random materials, no real color sense, anything like that. And it's really just to try and better understand the construction, the fit. And then you start dialing these things in as a triad of like, oh, do we need this piece on the shoe, or like how much does this prototype weigh, and then really starting to finesse the pattern from there. And then we'll ultimately get a pullover that we're all really happy with, given the point in time in that development round. And then we'll tell our manufacturing partners, okay, here's what we want to build. And, they'll typically have about a 6 to 8 week lead time to build all these samples. And, in that sampling round, we get, all the colors that we created for that round, as well as a number of wear testing pairs, because we want to be testing continuously. And they're typically done in 2 sizes. There's a key women's size and a key men's size. And then as we get to later rounds, we kind of go beyond that, just because if we started with 5 or 6 sizes off the bat, that gets really costly, because you're going to make revisions to the sole unit, to midsole molds. And so you have to be conscious of that from a budgeting standpoint.
Wow, cool, fascinating. So I want to sort of move over to the manufacturing process, but before we do, I'm going to go to the chat here because there's a great question that I think is going to be relevant and important to a lot of trail runners. It comes from Troy Meadows, our boy in Petaluma. He says, the performance shoe market creates so much waste after the life of the product. Can Bryan and Dave talk about the new technology coming down the pipeline to create a complete circle, an approach to product life cycle? Maybe talk about any of the sort of sustainability efforts that are being made at Brooks and at Speedland. Dave, we can start with you.
Sure. Well, with Speedland, I mean, we took we were very cognizant of that from the start, and so we designed with end of life in mind, and that's why we stitched the product together and used very little glue. So at the end of life, you can take it apart and recycle the parts accordingly. I think that's pretty unique in the industry. There are materials that are getting, to be more recyclable, obviously, from all the different parts, and you'll see brands that are attempting to do things around that, which is great. But in our case, there's this balance of making things recyclable and also making sure that keeping the highest performance possible. So, we don't want to sacrifice performance necessarily, but at the same point, we want to make the smart decision around, recyclability and what we can do. So that's kind of where we are right now. As anytime there's a material advance and we can, even if we have to spend more and use that instead of another material, and get the same performance, we'll do it no matter what. But at this point, there's still some materials that they haven't quite figured out how to make them perfectly, let's say, recyclable, but the performance is still at a higher level. So that's what's happening. Advancements in materials are happening, and as those happen, a lot brands will make the choices to switch things out, and you can see Brooks is working hard on that as well. So that's kind of where we are. But I think just making smart choices from the beginning before you even create a product, and thinking about the end of life, that's the key to the whole thing.
Yeah. And Dave, I've got 2 pairs of shoes I got to drop by your house for you to break down and recycle for me. Bryan, talk about the sustainability efforts that are happening over at Brooks.
Yeah, it's quite massive, and I'm really proud of Brooks for taking the step forward. And it kind of starts, it's a multifaceted approach, and I can't really get into too many of the details, but I will say that from the product team all the way to our manufacturing partners, there are really smart choices that we're starting to make. A really basic example of something that we do, in addition to using 100% recycled materials in the upper, laces, trims, meshes for the upper, we're also really cognizant of the material yield. So how we pattern the pieces of an upper to reduce the amount of waste or scrap, and then eventually creating kind of a stream of collecting the scrap product and being able to recycle that, all the way to potentially utilizing renewable energy, water soluble cements and primers. So being really diligent about the entire manufacturing process, about minimizing waste, because we do know that this industry, does create a lot of waste, and it's still a very manual process. We're not there to this point where the automotive industry is, or the medical industry is, where everything is robotic. We're still working with very soft materials that have a high kind of tolerance to them, and so just being really considerate in terms of our choices of materials, utilizing recycled options when possible, and then working closely with our vendors, our suppliers, to empower them to make more sustainable choices.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I'm so happy to hear that technology and material advancements are occurring, and that people at the big brands and at the small brands are considering this. And I think it's obviously very important to trail runners and trail consumers. So thanks for shining a light on that for us. So let's talk about manufacturing. So after sort of the prototyping is done, you're confident in the samples that you receive. What happens from there? Bryan, we'll start with you.
So we have this massive team that we call operations or commercialization manufacturing team. They consist of a lot of different functions, production engineers, commercialization engineers, and a lot of times there's kind of this left seat, right seat ride during the product creation process, during design and development, where you do have a commercialization engineer, and their primary role is to figure out how you go from 1 to 100,000 or 10,000 or a million pairs. And they're oftentimes providing suggestions that ensure the manufacturability of a certain product. If they're like, hey, actually, if you adjust the pattern, a certain way, the cutting efficiency is going to be a little bit better, or you're going to waste a little bit less material, or you're going to utilize more of this piece of material, or it's going to be slightly faster to produce it this way without any detriment to performance. And so they're providing that sort of feedback throughout the product creation process. And it's something that the product teams, the triads, do have to have a high level of knowledge on, because we have to consider this stuff from the get-go. But the commercialization team is then responsible for figuring out, how do we grade these sizes? So if we're starting with a women's 8.5 and a men's 9 shoe size, what does that mean when we grade these out to larger and smaller sizes in terms of the increments, as well as, building all the associated tooling to accommodate a larger volume. And then you're working with factory partners to figure out how many production lines you need to build the number of pairs that you forecasted. And this is, done with multiple shoes at one time. So
wow,
the logistics game here is massive. And those teams, just have a tremendous amount of talent in terms of figuring this out to get shoes on the market. It's just like when shoes get to market, you're just like, that's impressive. Like just the logistical feat.
Sounds overwhelming to me.
Yeah.
So Dave, talk also about the manufacturing process. And one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is how you take that original vision and interface with the manufacturer in a way that gives you confidence that they're going to understand your vision and execute against it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, in our case, in Speedland's case, or I guess in any case, is the relationship with the factory is critical, right? And even more critical if you're trying to do something different that hasn't been done before. And usually, in best case scenario, you want to be face to face, trying to do this in person, trying to explain things in person, especially if you haven't done it before, because there is something lost. Lost in translation, lost in communication if you're not in person on that. But if you have that and you have a great factory relationship, the factory is key to your success. They can't be underestimated in what they're doing. So with Speedland, that was a huge part of it, having a relationship and having a trust with the factory that knew what we were trying to accomplish.
Yeah. So all over the news right now is the supply chain crisis. And I was going to ask you about this. And Cody Jett also asked in the chat about what's going on within the global footwear supply chain right now. Can you guys provide any color to that?
Yeah. You want me to start, Bryan?
Go ahead, Dave. Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, I think whether you're big or small, I think you're kind of in some ways dealing with the same situation, just at different levels, obviously. And there are different, if you're making stuff overseas and if say there's some sort of problem going on in China, yes, you can make stuff in Vietnam, but if there's that's same problem could be going on in Vietnam. And so it just shifts. I think what it's showing is there could be a renewal in more localized manufacturing in the future, right? Because that really starts to answer the needs and get after that when there are problems. If we can do stuff more locally, more regionally, and it also goes back to the recyclability question and sustainability question, right? Because then you take the whole shipping equation in a different way as well. So I think that's where things are pushing, and that's whether you're talking about footwear, whether you're talking about electronics, no matter what, you can see that brands are investing more regionally and locally, and that's where I see things going in the future.
Awesome. Bryan, did you want to add anything to that?
Supply
chain issues?
Sure. I think, at a practical product level, we're seeing lead times increase significantly with our suppliers. And so we just have to be really diligent about making definitive choices early and placing those material orders to our vendors, much further ahead of time than we typically would. And it takes a little bit of wiggle room out at the very end in terms of making small tweaks here and there. So really it forces the product teams to be really rooted in what you're doing and knowing exactly why you're doing it, because you might not get another chance to make that modification because you simply might run out of time, because you have to consider the lead time extension that's been tacked on to really every product.
I think, Dylan, just that what's hard right now is things are really unpredictable. And like last week, a province I'll just take a province in China was shut down for a week because of some COVID restrictions, right? And that happened to be where they make a good amount of iPhones, and that's just unpredictable, right? Like you don't know that's going to happen, and then it's going to move on to another province, say. So it's just, you can do all you want, but you don't know what you don't know anymore. And I think getting, like Bryan, like you said, getting stuff ahead of time and being way ahead of it is just going to be the safer way until there can be more manufacturing back in the States. And that's all about doing things differently. So,
yeah. So real quick, because we got a question in the chat about this too, and I'll pull it up so that we give him the proper credit. It's from Brian Fagundis, and he's asking about the economic and structural incentives that are in place to bring production and factories back to the US. Obviously, you've both referenced the fact that most of the manufacturing is done in Asia. That's not a revelation across every industry. Are we seeing more of a push to reshore some of that manufacturing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a difference in scale too. So, in the case of when you're talking smaller scales, like what we're trying to do at Speedland, it's very real that can be done because you're working on a smaller scale and you're building stuff very differently. So it can be done. I think it could be a little bit different conversation when you're talking hundreds of thousands, millions of pairs of shoes, because you have to change the process drives new manufacturing, and so you actually have to change process. So I think it's a little two different tales here, but I don't know, Bryan, what you would say to that.
Yeah, I would just add on to that by saying, in addition to maybe bringing manufacturing, closer to the US, it could be more regional manufacturing, because we sell shoes all over the world. So if there are more regional manufacturing hubs that are less dependent on one specific part of the world for manufacturing, that could help offset any sort of lead time issues. Product is built more regionally and requires a shorter lead time with shipping. And so those are all opportunities that brands are looking into to try and optimize that delivery to the consumer, and as well as, sustainability is a big part of that as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. Yeah, I think that's going to be an interesting thing to monitor here in the next chapter of the footwear industry. So moving ahead, okay, we've got the manufacturing done. The product is in the appropriate place. How does sort of the product team then interface with the marketing team to tell the story and create campaigns that will hopefully touch the consumer, the customer, and hopefully drive sales? Dave, we'll start with you.
Well, yeah, and I mean, in my past life, I was trying to do that right from the start, honestly. So you have your so we'll go a level deeper here. You have your product line manager who's dealing with marketing from a product side. There's a whole nother marketing team that's bringing this to life from a communication standpoint, and whether that's big commercials or whether that's print or whether it's Instagram, whatever it is. There's a whole nother marketing team. Yep. And so the key is to also be interfacing with that team early on as well, right? Because if they can help you along the way and start that story with them, then you have a cohesive vision right from the start. Where it often falls apart, in my experience, is when this is not a cohesive vision or where a different story is told at the end that is not the story that was conceived at the beginning. So the advice I would give here to anybody who's working in this field or anything is to bring everybody along or work together right from the start. So you tell the vision from the start, even though that seems crazy because that's, 18 months away from when they're actually going to communicate this to the public. But that's really what you want to do, because otherwise you get two different stories that are disconnected, and then it's not authentic. And if something's not authentic, it's a failure. It's that simple.
Bryan, you want to add anything there?
I think Dave nailed it. But yeah, I think it's starting. Yeah, you got to have that communication, that interface, that connectedness with brand marketing from day one. They're receiving the same product brief that the rest of the product team is receiving from that product triad. And, I think when we're introducing new technologies, we really geek out with the brand marketing team on all the nuanced intricacies of what makes this technology special and imparting as much knowledge as possible. Yes, maybe the tagline will be, one line, which it should be. It needs to be clear, direct, and attractive to the consumer. But ultimately, that comes from a deep understanding of the technology and the product and the vision and the story. And so it's really important that they get all the details, along the way, and that they're invested in the journey of the product, just like the product triad is.
Amazing. Guys, this has been so fun. We should definitely do this again because I have a million other questions, but let's close with, what's the feeling like to actually see your product come to life? Like, what's the feeling like when you see somebody out on the trail rocking a pair of Speedlands or rocking a Cascadia or a Catamount? Bryan, we'll start with you. What's that feeling of satisfaction like?
It's a really amazing feedback loop. And I think, seeing someone run in product that you were able to touch is really humbling. And, for me, it's always about, if I have an opportunity to stop that person, hey, like, just out of curiosity, what do you think about this shoe? I really want to know the things that you don't like about the shoe so that I can make it better the next time, and it's really just about having that casual conversation. It is really a fun feedback loop to observe. And I think that's one of the cool things about product. The funny thing though is you're generally, working so far out that when you do see someone in the wild running on that, you're like, oh, I didn't realize that came to market. You almost forget about the introduction.
You're 2 years ahead.
So you're like, oh, wow, that's out now. I didn't know that,
Awesome.
But, yeah, it's fun.
Dave, what about you? Over the course of your career, there's got to be some awesome highlights of things that you've worked on, seeing them on Tom Brady's feed or Steph Curry's feed, or what's it like, as somebody who's been a creative since you were a kid and always trying to understand how things are built, to actually see what you've built come to life physically?
Yeah. It's always cool whether, it's always cool to see stuff on obviously a superstar of high caliber like that, but it's just as cool. I ran a race in January, and about, 15 or 16 miles in, I ran up next to somebody wearing Speedlands who, I did not know. And, I was wearing them, and he looked down, he's like, hey, you're wearing Speedlands like me. I'm like, yeah, what do you think of them? And then we had a conversation for another couple miles, where we ran together. So, I think, it's equally cool no matter who it is. And you have some sort of, I don't know how to quantify in words, but some sort of appreciation for it, because a lot of work went into the product, and it's kind of it's better than any award or anything else to see it on people out, really.
Yeah. Rad. Well, guys, this has been so much fun. For those who are watching, the SLHSV is out now. It sounds like the new Caldera is coming out very soon. So check out what these guys have been working on. Dave, I'm expecting my prototypes here very soon of some very top secret thing. No pressure, but
we just got something in today, Dylan.
I'll be on my way over.
Good.
No, but guys, this has been an absolute pleasure. Really appreciate your expertise and your ability to sort of capture the essence of it and explain it in a way that even idiots like me can understand. Thanks everybody for watching. Really appreciate you for being here. Dave, Bryan, great to see you. Have a great weekend. Everybody else, we'll catch you very soon.